The air in Saigon Bloom thrummed with a life I had only ever dreamed of creating. It was a symphony of clinking glasses, the low murmur of satisfied diners, and the percussive sizzle from my kitchen, the heartbeat of my very soul. Just 3 weeks ago, this place was an empty shell of drywall and potential. Now it was alive, breathing in the scent of lemongrass, star anise, and my own sweat-soaked ambition. At 30 years old, standing at the pass on opening night, I felt I had finally arrived. My reflection in the polished steel of the heat lamp showed a woman I barely recognized, tired, yes, with dark circles under her eyes, but blazing with a triumphant fire. This restaurant wasn't just a business. It was a testament, a declaration that the daughter of immigrants, the quiet girl who always found more comfort in the language of flavors than in words, could build something beautiful from scratch. My parents, David and Mai, were seated at the best table in the house, table 7, right by the large window overlooking Chicago's bustling Pilsen neighborhood. My mother kept dabbing her eyes with a napkin, her quiet pride radiating across the room. My father, a man of few words, simply nodded at me every time our eyes met, a gesture that contained a lifetime of approval. They had sacrificed everything, leaving a world they knew behind for a future they could only hope for. Tonight, watching them taste my boko, a recipe that wasn't just beef stew but my father's memory of a Saigon street vendor from 50 years ago, painstakingly recreated and elevated, I felt I had finally made their sacrifice worthwhile. My sister Isabelle was there too, of course. 2 years my senior, she was the family's polished diamond to my uncut stone. While I had spent my 20s in sweltering kitchens, working my way up from a line cook, Isabelle had climbed the corporate ladder at a prestigious financial firm downtown. She arrived in a sharp, tailored blazer, her laughter loud and confident as she mingled with my guests. When she came to the kitchen to congratulate me, she wrapped me in a hug that smelled of expensive perfume and success. She told me how proud she was, how she always knew my stubbornness would pay off. Her words were perfect, just like everything else about her, but they felt scripted, rehearsed. As she pulled away, I saw a flicker in her eyes, something quick and unreadable that vanished before I could place it. I dismissed it as my own exhaustion. I was running on fumes and adrenaline, seeing shadows where there were none. My best friend and sous chef Marco caught my eye from across the kitchen. He gave me a supportive grin but shot a brief, skeptical look in Isabelle's retreating direction. Marco had a knack for seeing through facades, a skill I often lacked. He once told me that Isabelle's smile never quite reached her eyes, but I had brushed it off as him being overprotective. Tonight I chose to see only a family united in my success. I chose to believe in the perfection of the moment. For one night, I was not the younger sister, the artistic one who took the less stable path. I was Chloe Tran, chef and owner of the hottest new Vietnamese restaurant in Chicago. I was whole. I was happy. That feeling, so potent and pure, was the last truly happy moment I would know for a very long time. The descent began not with a bang, but with a whisper of fatigue. At first, I blamed it on the grueling 18-hour days of a new restaurant owner. The exhaustion was a heavy cloak I couldn't shrug off. Then came the dizzy spells, the subtle but persistent nausea that made the very smells of my kitchen once my greatest joy turn my stomach. I started losing weight. My parents told me I was working too hard, that I needed to rest. Isabelle called and told me to hire a better general manager and delegate her advice, practical and devoid of any real concern. Marco was the only one who looked at me with genuine worry, often finishing my sentences when my breath would catch, or taking over the expediting line when he saw a tremor in my hands. The crash came on a busy Tuesday night. We were in the middle of the dinner rush, the printer spitting out orders like a machine gun. I was plating a delicate cha ca lavang, my tweezers hovering over a piece of pan-seared halibut. A wave of heat washed over me, a terrifying furnace igniting behind my eyes. The vibrant colors of the turmeric and dill blurred into a sickening brown smudge. The roar of the kitchen faded into a distant hum, as if I were sinking underwater. I heard Marco shout my name, his voice warped and slow. My legs gave out. The last thing I saw before the world went black was the beautiful plate of fish I'd so carefully crafted shattering on the tiled floor. Waking up was a slow, disorienting process. The first thing I registered was not a sight or a sound, but a smell, the sterile, antiseptic scent of a hospital that was the polar opposite of my fragrant kitchen. My head pounded. I was in a stiff, unfamiliar bed, an IV needle taped to the back of my hand. My parents were huddled in a corner, their faces etched with a fear I had never seen before. Isabelle stood by the window, her back to me, talking quietly on her phone. A kind-faced doctor with tired eyes came in and explained what had happened. He used words I didn't understand, a clinical jargon that felt like a foreign language, acute, progressive, bilateral. I just stared at him, my mind a fog, until he finally cut through the medical speak and delivered the blow in plain, brutal English. He told me that my kidneys were failing, not just struggling but failing completely. He said I had end-stage renal failure. The words didn't compute. It felt like a mistake, a diagnosis for someone else, someone older, sicker. I was 30. I had just opened a restaurant. I had plans. I had a life to live. I looked at my parents, hoping they would tell me it was a misunderstanding, but my mother's silent, streaming tears confirmed the nightmare. The doctor continued, his voice gentle but firm. He said I needed a kidney transplant, urgently. Without one, the only option was dialysis, a life tethered to a machine 3 or 4 times a week for the rest of my life. The national transplant list, he explained, had a waiting period of years. Years I might not have. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My vibrant, flavor-filled life suddenly shrank to the confines of this sterile white room, to the grim reality of a failing body. My dream, Saigon Bloom, felt like a distant, mocking memory. How could I run a kitchen if I couldn't even run my own body? Despair was a cold, heavy tide pulling me under. I felt a profound, suffocating loneliness. It was into this abyss of silence and fear that my sister's voice cut through. She had finished her call and turned to face us. Her expression was one I had never seen on her before, a mask of grim determination and profound seriousness. She walked to the foot of my bed, her gaze fixed on me. Everyone in the room turned to her. She announced with the gravity of a queen making a decree that she was going to get tested. She told us all that she would donate one of her kidneys to me. The shift in the room was immediate and electric. The crushing despair was instantly replaced by a tidal wave of relief. My mother let out a choked sob, rushing to embrace her eldest daughter. My father, his face crumpling with emotion, whispered that she was a saint, a savior. They clung to her as if she were a lifeboat in a raging storm. And in that moment she was. I stared at her from my hospital bed, speechless. All the small petty resentments I'd ever held against her, the feeling of being overshadowed, the subtle digs, the scripted praise evaporated. How could I have ever doubted her? This was not just an offer. It was the ultimate act of sisterly love, a sacrifice of biblical proportions. She was willing to undergo major surgery to give me a piece of herself so that I could live. The next few days were a blur of medical tests, consultations, and anxious waiting. Isabelle was a pillar of strength through it all. She handled the doctors with her corporate efficiency, asking sharp, intelligent questions and scheduling appointments with an assertive calm that I, in my weakened state, could only admire. She was perfect. The dutiful daughter, the heroic sister. Then the call came. We were all gathered in my parents' living room, the air thick with tension. Isabelle's phone rang and she put it on speaker. It was the transplant coordinator from the hospital. After a brief preamble, she delivered the news we had all been praying for. Isabelle was a perfect match. The eruption of joy was deafening. My parents wept openly, thanking God and thanking their heroic daughter. I cried 2 tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. The death sentence had been lifted. The future, which had been a terrifying black void just days before, was suddenly filled with light and possibility again. I could already picture myself back in my kitchen, the heat of the stoves on my face, the scent of pho in the air. I could see myself growing old, maybe even opening a second restaurant one day. All because of Isabelle. That night, as she drove me back to my apartment, I tried to find the words to express the depth of my gratitude. I told her that I didn't know how I could ever repay her, that she was giving me back my life, my dream, everything. She just smiled, her eyes on the dark Chicago streets. She told me that's what family was for. She said there was nothing to repay. Her voice was smooth and reassuring, but as we pulled up to my building, she turned to me. The streetlights cast strange shadows across her face, and for a fleeting second, that unreadable flicker was back in her eyes. She told me that before the surgery, there were just a few things we needed to discuss, some formalities to get in order to protect us both. She suggested we meet for coffee in a few days to talk privately. I agreed without a second thought, my heart too full of hope to register the cold, transactional tone in her voice. I was so blinded by the promise of salvation that I couldn't see the glint of the knife she was holding behind her back. She was my sister, my blood, my savior. She was giving me back my life. I just didn't know yet what she planned to take in return. The days leading up to my coffee meeting with Isabelle were a strange purgatory. Life had split into 2 distinct, warring realities. In one, I was a patient, a collection of symptoms and chart numbers. 3 times a week, I would sit in a cold reclining chair at the dialysis clinic, the chemical scent of disinfectant clinging to the air. For 4 hours, I would watch my own blood leave my body, journey through a humming, whirring machine that acted as my external kidneys and then return cleansed but somehow alien. The process left me utterly depleted, a ghost haunting my own skin. The fatigue was a physical weight pressing down on my bones, and the world seemed to be perpetually shrouded in a thin gray fog. I had to close the restaurant, temporarily putting up a sign that cited unexpected maintenance. Each day it remained closed, a piece of my spirit withered. But in my other reality, the one I clung to with every ounce of my will, I was a survivor on the brink of a miracle. I was the recipient of the most profound gift one human could give another. In this reality, the debilitating weakness was temporary, the humming of the dialysis machine merely a prelude to the symphony of my kitchen restarting. Isabelle's promise was a sunbeam in my gray fog world. I pictured her not as my corporate climber sister but as an angel, a guardian. I replayed her declaration at the hospital over and over in my mind, each repetition washing away years of petty jealousies and quiet rivalries. She was my big sister. She was saving me. This thought alone gave me the strength to endure the needles, the exhaustion, the loss of my own autonomy. I sometimes found myself drifting back to our childhood, searching for the roots of this incredible person she had become. I remembered a time in 3rd grade when a boy named Kevin had pushed me on the playground, making me scrape my knee. I had been too shy to fight back, my eyes welling with tears. Isabelle, who was in 5th grade, saw it from across the yard. She marched over, her pigtails flying behind her, and stood in front of this boy who was a head taller than her. I couldn't hear what she said, but I saw her point a finger at his chest, her expression so fierce that he actually took a step back before scurrying away. She then helped me up, dusted off my dress, and walked me to the nurse's office, holding my hand the entire way. She had been my protector then. It made perfect sense that she would be my protector now. We decided to meet at a quiet café in Lincoln Park, a neutral territory far from the prying eyes of our community. I arrived first, choosing a small table in the corner. I was wearing a beanie to cover my thinning hair, a side effect of the illness that felt like a particularly cruel joke for a woman who had just started to feel beautiful. When Isabelle walked in, she looked as vibrant as I felt faded. She wore a chic trench coat, her hair perfectly styled, her face a mask of composed concern. She ordered us both lattes and sat down, her expensive leather handbag clicking softly as she placed it on the empty chair beside her. For a few minutes we engaged in the pleasantries of strangers. She asked how my latest dialysis session had gone. I told her it was draining but manageable. I asked about her work. She told me about a big merger she was handling, her words crisp and professional. The conversation felt hollow, a performance for an invisible audience. I steered it back to the transplant, telling her again how grateful I was, how I was already dreaming of new dishes I would create for the restaurant once I recovered. She listened patiently, taking a slow sip of her latte. When I finished, she placed her cup down with a deliberate click. It was a sound that seemed to cut through the cafe's ambient noise, a signal that the performance was over. She told me she was glad I was thinking about the future because that's what she wanted to talk about. Her future. From her handbag, she produced a thick manila envelope and slid it across the table. It landed in front of me with a soft, definitive thud. It had my name typed on a neat white label. I looked at it, then back at her, a knot of confusion tightening in my stomach. She explained that it was just some paperwork her lawyer had drafted. She called it a precaution, a way to ensure that her significant sacrifice was formally acknowledged and that her future was secure should anything go wrong. My hand trembled slightly as I opened the clasp and pulled out the contents. It wasn't a medical form or a consent waiver. It was a multi-page legal document, dense with clauses and sub-clauses. The title at the top of the first page made the air leave my lungs: Asset Transfer and Ownership Agreement. I scanned the document, my vision blurring, the legal jargon swimming before my eyes. But certain phrases leaped out, searing themselves into my brain, in consideration for the donation of a living kidney. The undersigned Chloe Tran agrees to transfer an 80% controlling interest in the business entity known as Saigon Bloom LLC. 80%. The number was so absurd, so monstrous that my first reaction was utter disbelief. This had to be a mistake, a grotesque, unfunny joke. I looked up at Isabelle, expecting to see a smirk, a sign that she was just teasing me in some twisted way. But her face was perfectly serene, her expression as cool and hard as polished marble. There was no joke here. I asked her what this was. My voice came out as a broken whisper. She replied calmly, as if explaining a simple business proposal. She stated that she was giving me the gift of life, a priceless asset. In return, it was only fair that I provide her with a tangible asset to secure her own future. She reminded me taking a significant health risk. What if there were complications? What if her remaining kidney had issues down the line? This restaurant, my restaurant, was my most valuable possession. She considered it a fair exchange, an exchange. She was framing my life as a transaction. A hostile takeover of my body paid for with the soul of my dream. The memory of her defending me on the playground, shattered, replaced by another darker one. It was from a middle school bake sale. I had spent a week perfecting a recipe for Boncam sesame balls with a sweet mung bean filling. They were my pride and joy. On the day of the sale, Isabelle, who had refused to help me, took my entire batch, presented them as her own, and won first prize. When I tearfully confronted her, she had laughed and told me I should be flattered. She said she had done me a favor by giving my little hobby a bigger stage. She had taken my creation, my hard work, and claimed it as her own, and she genuinely believed she was entitled to it. Looking at her now across the table, I saw the same person. The same chilling sense of entitlement magnified to a terrifying life or death scale. I asked her how she could do this. I reminded her that Saigon Bloom was everything to me. It was built on my savings, on loans I was still paying off, on years of my life I could never get back. An 80% stake wasn't a security measure, it was an execution. It would make me an employee in my own restaurant, a stranger in my own dream. Her expression didn't soften. She told me I was being overly emotional. She said that from a logical standpoint it was a fantastic deal for me. I would get to live and I would still retain 20% and my role as head chef. She said that frankly I was a talented cook but a poor businesswoman. With her financial acumen, she could turn the restaurant into a real empire. My creativity, her business sense. She framed it as a partnership, a word so twisted in this context that it made me physically ill. The world began to spin. The low hum of the café became a roar in my ears. I felt the same sensation I had the night I collapsed, as if I were sinking. Here in this bright, cheerful café, my own sister was holding my life for ransom. She wasn't my savior. She was my captor. The promise of salvation had been nothing but a gilded cage. I stumbled out of the café, leaving the contract on the table. I don't remember the drive home. The next thing I knew, I was standing in my parents' living room, the hateful document clutched in my fist. I was sobbing, unable to form coherent sentences at first, just brokenly repeating the words 80% and she wants to take it. When I finally managed to gasp out the whole story, I expected fury. I expected them to call Isabelle, to scream at her, to disown her for this monstrous act. I expected them to wrap their arms around me and tell me we would find another way. Instead, a dreadful silence filled the room. My father sank into his armchair, his face pale. My mother just stared at the floor, wringing her hands. Then my mother spoke, her voice barely audible. She asked if maybe Isabelle was just scared. She said that major surgery was a terrifying thing and perhaps this was just her sister's clumsy way of seeking reassurance. My father cleared his throat. He looked at me, his eyes full of a pain that I knew was not for my betrayal but for the impossible choice laid before us. He told me that a restaurant was just bricks and mortar, that dreams could be rebuilt. But life, he said, his voice cracking, life was singular. You only get one. He didn't say the words, but the implication hung heavy and suffocating in the air. Sign the papers. Your life is worth more than your dream. In that moment, I felt a betrayal deeper and more profound than what Isabelle had dealt me. My own parents, the people who were supposed to be my staunchest defenders, were so paralyzed by their fear of losing me that they were willing to sacrifice me to the wolf. They were asking me to mutilate my own soul to save my body. The loneliness was absolute. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. I fled their house and drove to the one person I knew would understand. I found Marco in the empty, dark kitchen of Saigon Bloom. He was taking inventory, his loyalty so profound that he was still caring for my dream even when I couldn't. I sat on a prep stool under a single dim light and told him everything, my voice flat and dead. When I finished, he didn't offer platitudes or excuses for my family. His face was a mask of cold fury. He slammed his clipboard down on the stainless steel counter, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent kitchen. He called Isabelle a vulture, a monster feeding on her own family. He said that this wasn't an exchange. It was an extortion, pure and simple. His anger was a balm on my shattered heart. It was the validation I so desperately needed. He saw the situation for what it was, with no filter of fear or misguided family loyalty. He looked at me, his dark eyes fierce. He told me that my life was worth everything, but a life without a soul wasn't a life at all. He told me he would stand by me no matter what I chose. He promised that we would fight this. I went home that night and sat in my dark apartment, the legal contract spread out on my coffee table. The words seemed to mock me from the page. Outside the city of Chicago hummed with life, with millions of stories, millions of heartbreaks and triumphs. But inside, my world had shrunk to this single impossible choice. My sister's kidney, a promise of breath and future, lay on one side of the scale. On the other lay my restaurant, my passion, my very identity. Isabelle had engineered it perfectly. She was forcing me to choose which part of myself I was willing to kill in order to survive. Suffering, I learned, is not a single crushing event. It is a slow, methodical dismantling of the self. My life became a series of small humiliations, each one chipping away at the woman I used to be. The dialysis clinic was my new reality, a place where time was measured in the slow drip of IV fluids and the rhythmic pulse of the machine that was keeping me alive. The other patients, mostly decades older than me, would offer weary smiles, a silent acknowledgement of our shared purgatory. I was the youngest person there by a generation, a living, breathing anomaly that seemed to make them even more aware of their own mortality. They saw a young woman with a whole life ahead of her, not knowing that my future was being held hostage in a manila envelope that sat on my coffee table like a dormant bomb. The physical toll was immense. My body felt like a battlefield. The constant fatigue was a leaden weight in my limbs and a metallic taste, a side effect of the toxins my kidneys could no longer filter, coated my tongue, mocking my chef's palate. But the emotional toll was infinitely worse. My parents' visits became unbearable. They no longer saw me. They saw a problem that had a simple, albeit painful, solution. Their conversations were no longer about my well-being, but about logistics. My mother would talk about how we could rebrand the restaurant after Isabelle took over, suggesting new menus with a more commercial appeal. She spoke as if my dream were already dead and she was simply arranging the funeral. My father, in his quiet way, was even more devastating. One evening, he sat by my bed and told me a story about his own father in Vietnam who had sold his ancestral land to pay for a life-saving surgery for his wife. He told me that land was just dirt, but family was blood. He said that a wise person knows when to let go of pride to hold on to what truly matters. He thought he was being profound, offering a parable of sacrifice. All I heard was that my life's work, the physical manifestation of my soul, was nothing more than dirt. I knew they loved me, but their love was suffocating me, pressing me toward the very thing that would erase me. They were so terrified of my death that they were actively helping Isabelle kill my spirit. The peak of my despair came a week after our meeting at the café. I was at home after a particularly brutal dialysis session. I had stumbled into the apartment, my body aching, and collapsed onto the sofa. The contract was still there, a pale square in the dim light. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the sharp typed letters of my name. For a moment, I gave in. The fight had drained out of me, leaving a hollow echo. What was the point? I was too tired to fight, too weak to imagine a future where I won. Maybe they were right. Maybe a life as a glorified employee in my own restaurant was better than no life at all. I imagined myself signing the document, the scratch of the pen, a sound of final surrender. I pictured Isabelle's triumphant smile, my parents' relieved sighs. In that moment, the thought of an end to the struggle, any end, felt like a mercy. It was this image, the image of their relief at my submission, that saved me. A tiny cold spark ignited in the hollow space inside my chest. It wasn't hope, it was rage. Pure, undiluted, and shockingly vital. It was the first strong emotion I had felt in weeks that wasn't despair. How dare they? How dare they mourn the potential loss of my body while actively murdering my soul and calling it love? How dare Isabelle wrap her greed in the language of sacrifice? That night I made a decision. I would not sign the contract. But simply refusing was not enough. It was too passive, too quiet. Isabelle had orchestrated a slow, cruel psychological torture designed to break me down until I handed her my dream on a silver platter. She didn't deserve a simple no. She deserved to have her perfect, benevolent mask ripped from her face in front of the very people she had so masterfully manipulated. She wanted to be a hero. I would show everyone the monster hiding beneath the cape. My suffering had reached its apex. Now it was time for it to be forged into a weapon. The first step was to change the narrative. I called Marco and told him to meet me at the restaurant. When he arrived, he found me not in a puddle of tears, but standing in the center of my dark kitchen, my eyes burning with a new cold light. Before he could ask, I told him I was done being the victim. I told him I was going to give Isabelle exactly what she wanted, a final meeting to sign the papers. He started to protest, his face clouding with anger, but I held up a hand to stop him. I explained that it would be a performance, a final act, and I needed his help to set the stage. As I laid out my plan, I saw a slow, predatory grin spread across his face. The satisfaction was instantaneous. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't just reacting to my fate, I was seizing control of it. The pain in my heart didn't vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer a crushing weight, but a source of fuel, sharp and clean. The next day, I called Isabelle. I pitched my voice to sound weak, defeated. I told her she was right, that my parents were right. I told her I had been emotional and hadn't been thinking clearly. I said that my life was the most important thing and that I was ready to sign the agreement. The satisfaction on the other end of the line was almost palpable. I could hear the subtle shift in her tone from strained patience to triumphant condescension. She told me I was making a wise decision, the only decision. We agreed to meet at Saigon Bloom in 2 days' time. She wanted the signing to happen on my territory, a final symbolic act of conquest. I readily agreed. Next, I called my parents. I told them the same story. I said I had thought about what they'd said and that I was going to sign the papers to put an end to all this suffering. The relief in their voices was a bitter pill, but I swallowed it down. I told them I wanted them to be there. I framed it as needing their support, wanting them to witness this difficult but necessary step. My mother readily agreed, telling me how proud she was of me for being so brave and selfless. The irony was so thick it was almost laughable. They thought they were coming to witness a surrender. They had no idea they were about to be the sole audience for an execution. With the players in place, Marco and I prepared the stage. The restaurant was the perfect setting, a place that represented both my greatest love and my deepest potential loss. Marco purchased a tiny, high-fidelity audio recorder, the kind journalists use for interviews. It was no bigger than a pen cap. We tested it, and the playback was crystal clear. The plan was simple. I would place it on the table between us, concealed within a small, decorative vase of dried flowers. I would lead Isabelle to a confession to expose the envy and cruelty that truly motivated her. I needed more than just the contract. I needed her own words to condemn her. The 48 hours before the meeting were the longest of my life, but the dynamic had shifted. The suffering was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface, but it was now overlaid with a thrilling, terrifying sense of purpose. Each successful step of the plan, Isabelle's smug agreement, my parents' naive acceptance, the procurement of the recorder was a small victory, a dose of anesthetic for my wounded soul. The feeling of helplessness began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged resolve. I felt like a chef preparing for the most important service of their life, meticulously arranging each ingredient, controlling the temperature, anticipating the final plating. On the appointed evening, I arrived at the restaurant an hour early. It was dark and silent, filled with the ghosts of happy diners. I walked through the kitchen, my hand trailing over the cool stainless steel counters. This was my sanctuary, and Isabelle had tried to desecrate it. I placed the small vase with the hidden recorder on table 7, the table where my parents had sat on opening night, radiating pride. The symbolism was perfect. I sat down to wait the hateful contract and a pen placed neatly before me. I looked at my reflection in the dark window. The woman staring back was still pale, still sick, but her eyes were different. The fog of despair was gone. In its place was a storm. When my parents arrived, they hugged me tightly, whispering words of encouragement. They saw my calm demeanor as acceptance, a sign of peaceful resignation. They had no idea it was the calm of a predator waiting for its prey to step into the trap. Then Isabelle walked in. She was a vision of corporate success, holding a briefcase containing her copy of the contract. She gave our parents a warm, magnanimous smile, the hero of the hour. She then looked at me, her eyes gleaming with a victory she believed was already won. She sat down opposite me, placing her briefcase on the table with a confident snap. She told me she was so glad I had come to my senses. The trap was set. The audience was in place. The recording device was active. My heart was pounding a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, but on the outside I was perfectly still. The suffering was a coiled snake in my gut, but the thought of what was to come, the imminent unmasking, was a pure, exhilarating shot of adrenaline. I picked up the pen not to sign but to point it at her. It was time for the final act to begin. The silence in Saigon Bloom was a physical entity. It was thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of my parents' misguided relief and Isabelle's predatory triumph. She sat opposite me, radiating an aura of serene control. To our parents, she was the benevolent savior, graciously accepting the terms of a necessary if unfortunate sacrifice. To me, she was a vulture poised to pick the meat from the bones of my life's work. The small vase of dried flowers between us containing the hidden recorder felt like the only real thing on the table. The contract was a prop. The pen in my hand was a weapon. I began the performance with the deference of the defeated. I looked up from the contract and told Isabelle that before I signed, I just needed to understand. My voice was intentionally fragile, laced with a tremor of manufactured helplessness. I said that for my own peace of mind, for the part of me that was dying with this dream, I needed to hear why. Why 80%? Why couldn't it have been a loan or a smaller percentage as collateral? I needed to understand why the price for her love had to be annihilation. My parents shifted uncomfortably. My mother started to interject to tell me not to upset my sister, that the decision was made. But Isabelle held up a perfectly manicured hand, silencing her. My question had appealed to her ego. She saw it not as a challenge, but as a final request from a condemned prisoner. She leaned forward, her expression softening into one of condescending sympathy. She explained in a tone one might use with a child that it was never about the money. She said she had her own successful career and didn't need the restaurant. This, she explained, was about principle. It was about teaching me a lesson in pragmatism. She told me that I had always lived in a fantasy world of passion and art, while she had lived in the real world of assets and liabilities. She said my restaurant was a beautiful hobby, but it was financially vulnerable. She, with her superior business mind, would protect it, grow it, and turn my little passion project into a real profitable enterprise. She was framing her hostile takeover as an act of fiscal responsibility, a benevolent intervention. Her arrogance was breathtaking. This was my opening. I pushed a little harder, keeping my voice soft. I told her I understood the business angle, but this felt so personal. I brought up our childhood, reminding her of the bake sale, of how she had taken my sesame balls and claimed them as her own. I asked, my voice cracking slightly, if this was the same thing, if she saw something I created and simply felt entitled to it. For the first time, a flicker of genuine irritation crossed her face. The mask of benevolence slipped for a fraction of a second. She told me not to be so dramatic and that the two situations were not comparable. One was a childish bake sale. This was a life-or-death situation for which she was the sole solution. She emphasized the words "sole solution," her gaze flicking toward our parents, reinforcing her role as the family's savior. But I had planted the seed. I had shifted the ground from a discussion of my health to a referendum on her character. Now it was time to water that seed with the truth. I looked at my parents. I told them that I understood their fear and their desire to see me live. But I asked them if they remembered when I first decided I wanted to be a chef. I was 12. I had tried to make my father's favorite dish, bun bo hui, and had messed it up completely. The broth was cloudy, the meat was tough. I had cried in frustration. Isabelle had laughed at me, telling me I should stick to my books and leave the cooking to Mom. But Dad, he had sat down with me, tasted my disastrous soup, and told me that he could taste the most important ingredient, love. He had told me never to let anyone, not even my sister, mock my passion. My father flinched, the memory hitting him with visible force. The foundation of his dirt versus blood argument was beginning to crack. I turned my attention back to Isabelle. "You don't want to protect this restaurant," I said, my voice losing its fragility and gaining a cold, hard edge. "You want to conquer it. You've always resented it. You resent that I built this with my own 2 hands while you were climbing a ladder someone else built. That's ridiculous," she snapped, her composure finally breaking. "I have a career you can't even comprehend. I manage portfolios worth millions. This little place is a rounding error in my world." "Is it?" I countered, my voice rising with controlled power. "Then why do you need 80% of a rounding error? This isn't about business, Isabelle. This is about the fact that, for the first time in our lives, I have something that you can't buy, something you didn't get first, and you can't stand it. You've spent your entire life being the successful one, the one our parents bragged about. But this place has a soul. And that's the one thing your Ivy League degree and your corner office could never give you." The accusation hung in the air, electric and undeniable. My mother gasped. My father stared at Isabelle, a dawning horror in his eyes. He was seeing her, truly seeing her for the first time. Isabelle's face, once a mask of serene control, was now a canvas of pure rage. The trap had been sprung and she knew it. She pushed back from the table, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She laughed, a sound utterly devoid of humor. It was a sharp, brittle sound that echoed in the silent restaurant. She told me I was a naive fool if I thought this was about jealousy. She said it was about power. She confessed that she wanted to see me beg. She wanted me to understand that my talent, my passion, my very life were all worthless without her permission. She wanted me to know unequivocally that she was the one with the power to give life and the power to take it away. She said that seeing me reduced to signing this contract would be more satisfying than any multi-million-dollar merger she had ever closed. Her voice was venomous, dripping with years of resentful poison that had finally found an outlet. "You want me to beg?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. I stood up, my own weakness, forgotten, fueled by a righteous fury. "You want me to hand over my soul and thank you for the privilege of living as your servant?" And then I delivered the final fatal blow. "The thing is, Isabelle," I said, reaching for the small vase on the table, "I don't need your kidney anymore." I turned the vase upside down and the tiny black recorder fell onto the table with a soft click. I picked it up and held it for them all to see. "Because every single word you just said, every drop of poison you just spewed has been recorded." The color drained from Isabelle's face. She stared at the small device in my hand as if it were a venomous snake poised to strike. My parents looked from the recorder to Isabelle's horrified expression, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in their minds with an awful, deafening finality. The hero they had worshipped was a monster, and my performance of weakness had been a meticulously crafted lie to expose her. "What is this?" my father whispered, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, Marco emerged from the kitchen. He wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a woman in her late 40s with a kind, serious face. "This," I announced, my voice ringing with a strength I didn't know I possessed, "is Dr. Lena Hansen. She's a transplant nephrologist at Northwestern Memorial." I explained that Marco, unable to accept my fate, had taken a desperate shot in the dark. He had researched my rare blood type and specific antigen markers, and had sent out a blast email to every nephrology department in the Midwest sharing my story and my urgent need. He had framed it as a community appeal, a chef beloved by her neighborhood in a desperate fight for her life. Dr. Hansen stepped forward. She explained to my stunned family that the hospital had a paired exchange program. They had found another pair in a similar situation, a man who needed a kidney and his wife who was willing to donate but was not a match for him. However, the incredible coincidence was that his wife was a perfect match for me, and I, or rather a compatible donor, would be a perfect match for him. For weeks they had been looking for the missing piece of the puzzle. They needed a living donor, my donor, to agree to donate to this other man, creating a chain that would save 2 lives instead of 1. My parents looked at Isabelle, a desperate, pleading hope in their eyes. Here was her chance at redemption. She could still be a hero. She could still save me and another person without her pound of flesh. All she had to do was say yes. Isabelle stood frozen, cornered. The entire narrative she had so carefully constructed, her sacrifice, her benevolence, her concern, had crumbled to dust around her. Donating to a stranger offered her no leverage, no power over me, no claim to my dream. It offered her only one thing, the chance to do a genuinely selfless act. And she couldn't do it. The silence stretched on thick with her indecision. In that silence, her true nature was laid bare for all to see. Her refusal was more damning than any recorded confession. I looked at my sister not with hatred but with a sudden, profound pity. Her entire life had been a performance, a relentless pursuit of a success that had left her utterly hollow inside. She had no soul to bargain with because she had already sold it piece by piece for promotions and praise. Finally, I spoke, my voice quiet but final. I told Dr. Hansen that my sister would not be donating her kidney. I then turned to Isabelle. I told her to take her contract, to take her ambition, and to get out of my restaurant, and out of my life. She didn't move for a moment, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. Then, without a word, she snatched her briefcase from the table and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the room like the final closing of a chapter, not just in my life but in the life of our family. My mother finally broke, collapsing into a chair, her sobs racking her body. My father stood motionless, looking at the door. His eldest daughter had just exited, his face a portrait of shattered pride and unbearable grief. They had not just lost a hero, they had discovered they had raised a villain. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The pain was still there, a deep, aching wound where a sister's love should have been. But the suffocating weight of her betrayal was gone. In its place was a clean, sharp clarity. The first part of my revenge was complete. I hadn't just refused her deal, I had systematically dismantled her identity. I had held up a mirror and forced her and our parents to see the ugly truth she had hidden for so long. The satisfaction was not a fiery, triumphant joy, but a quiet, deep, and steady hum. It was the feeling of taking back my own story. Dr. Hansen put a comforting hand on my arm. She told me not to lose hope. She said that now that they knew my situation, they would put me at the top of the regional list for a deceased donor. The wait would be uncertain, but there was still a chance. As I stood there between my weeping mother and my broken father in the heart of my silent restaurant, I knew one thing for sure. I didn't know if I would live or die, but I knew that whatever happened, I would face it on my own terms with my soul intact, and that I realized was a victory in itself. The aftermath of that night at Saigon Bloom was not a fiery explosion, but a slow, silent implosion. It was the quiet, creeping death of a family as we had known it. The air in my parents' home, once filled with the scent of simmering pho and the sound of boisterous conversation, now hung thick with a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. It was the silence of shame, of grief, of questions that had no answers. My parents were ghosts haunting the hallways of their own lives. My mother, who had always been the vibrant heart of our family, retreated into a shell of herself. She stopped cooking. The kitchen, once her kingdom, became a sterile, unused space. She would spend hours sitting in the living room, staring at a blank television screen, her hands lying limp in her lap. When she did speak, her voice was a monotone whisper. She was a woman hollowed out by the revelation that the daughter she had lauded as a paragon of success was a moral void, and that she herself had been a willing accomplice in the psychological torture of her other child. Her pride in Isabelle had been a cornerstone of her identity. Without it, she seemed to have crumbled. My father's reaction was different, but no less devastating. He had always been a man defined by a simple, unwavering code of honor and family loyalty. Isabelle's actions hadn't just betrayed me, they had desecrated his entire belief system. He wandered through his days with a kind of stunned disbelief, as if he were trying to solve an impossible equation in his head. How could his daughter, the one who had checked every box of immigrant success, be capable of such calculated cruelty? He would pick up old family photo albums, his fingers tracing Isabelle's smiling face in picture after picture. Isabelle at her high school graduation, Isabelle at her college commencement, Isabelle on the day she was promoted to vice president. He was searching for a clue, a sign he had missed, a hint of the monster that had been growing in plain sight. They tried to talk to me, of course. Their attempts were clumsy, freighted with a guilt so heavy it was almost embarrassing to witness. My mother would call and leave rambling, tearful voicemails apologizing for not believing me, for pushing me to sign the contract. She said she had been so blinded by fear that she couldn't see the truth. My father came to my apartment once, standing awkwardly at the door, holding a bag of groceries like a peace offering. He told me he was sorry that he had failed me as a father. He said his desire to protect me had made him an instrument of my sister's cruelty. I listened to their apologies, but the words felt like echoes in an empty room. I knew they were sincere, but sincerity couldn't erase the fact that when I had been at my most vulnerable, they had chosen the side of my tormentor. They had looked at my pain and told me it was a fair price to pay for my survival. Their betrayal wasn't born of malice like Isabelle's, but of weakness, and in some ways that felt even more tragic. I told them I needed time. It was the kindest thing I could say, because the truth was I didn't know if the trust that had been shattered between us could ever be fully repaired. And then there was Isabelle. The silence from her was absolute. She didn't call, she didn't text, she didn't try to explain or apologize. She simply vanished. According to a cousin who worked in the same building downtown, she continued to go to work, her public facade of a competent, powerful executive perfectly intact. But the cousin noted that something was different. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle, defensive posture. She no longer lingered for small talk in the hallways. She moved through the world with the grim purpose of someone just trying to get from one moment to the next without breaking. The true extent of her collapse, however, was revealed to me by Marco. His network of friends in the restaurant and business communities was extensive, and whispers began to reach him. Isabelle's carefully constructed world was fracturing from the inside out. Her heroic story had already started to circulate among our extended family and friends. Before that night, the tale of the selfless sister willing to give a piece of herself to save her ailing sibling. Now the real story was spreading, a toxic counter-narrative that painted her not as a saint but as a sociopath. The first major crack appeared at a family function, a Lunar New Year celebration at my aunt's house that I was too unwell to attend. Isabelle, perhaps believing she could brazen it out, made an appearance. Marco's cousin, who was there, described the scene to him in vivid detail. When Isabelle walked in, a hush fell over the room. People who would normally have rushed to greet her suddenly found fascinating things to look at on the ceiling or on their plates. Uncles and aunts gave her curt, cold nods. Her own parents, who were also in attendance, pointedly ignored her presence. She was an island isolated by the sea of her own making. The cousin said he watched as Isabelle stood alone by the buffet table for nearly an hour, her confident smile slowly faltering, then collapsing entirely until she finally slipped out the back door without saying goodbye. The professional fallout was even more severe. The story, in a garbled but essentially accurate form, had leaked into her corporate world. A colleague of hers, an acquaintance of Marco's, told him that the atmosphere around Isabelle at the firm had become toxic. The story of her extorting her dying sister for a restaurant had become a piece of dark, whispered gossip. She was no longer seen as a sharp, ambitious executive. She was seen as a predator. People avoided being on projects with her. Her subordinates treated her with a fearful, cautious distance. Her power had always been derived from respect and sometimes fear, but now that was replaced by something far worse: contempt. The final devastating blow came about a month after our confrontation. Marco called me, his voice a strange mix of somber and satisfied. He had just heard from his contact at Isabelle's firm. There had been a major internal review for a partnership position, a position Isabelle had been considered the frontrunner for, the culmination of her entire career's ambition. She had been passed over. The official reason was vague, something about interpersonal team dynamics. But the unofficial reason was known to everyone: the partners couldn't trust the judgment or the character of a woman who would hold her own sister's life for ransom. That night, for the first time, I felt a pang of something other than anger or pity for Isabelle. I pictured her alone in her sterile, high-rise apartment, the glittering lights of Chicago spread out beneath her like a kingdom she could see but no longer rule. She had sacrificed everything: relationships, empathy, kindness, on the altar of her ambition, and now the god she had worshipped had rejected her offering. She had lost the partnership, she had lost the respect of her peers, and she had lost her family. All she had left was her money and her cavernous, empty success. My own journey continued on its precarious path. The wait for a kidney was a constant, low-level hum of anxiety in the back of my mind. Some days were filled with a fragile hope. Others were shadowed by the grim statistics Dr. Hansen had gently explained to me. My life was in a holding pattern, a series of dialysis treatments and doctor's appointments. But something had fundamentally changed within me. The rage that had fueled my revenge had cooled, leaving behind a quiet, steely resolve. I had faced the worst of human nature, and I had not broken. Marco was my rock. He ran the kitchen at Saigon Bloom, which we had managed to reopen on a limited schedule, with a ferocity and passion that honored my vision. He refused to let my dream die, even when my own body was failing me. He would bring me small cups of new broth creations to taste, asking for my opinion on the balance of spices. A simple act that made me feel like a chef again, not just a patient. One afternoon, as I was leaving the clinic, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost a whisper. It was Isabelle. It was the first time I had heard her voice since she had stormed out of my restaurant. She didn't offer an apology or an excuse. She just asked, her voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite place how I was doing. I told her I was the same, waiting. There was a long pause. Then she said, her voice cracking, that she had heard about the partnership. She told me it was all she had ever worked for, and now it was gone. She said that people looked at her differently now. She said she felt like a ghost. For a moment, I felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of justice served. This was what she deserved. This was the echo of the ruin she had tried to bring upon me. But then I heard a sound on the other end of the line, a raw, ragged sob. It was not the cry of a manipulator or a tyrant. It was the sound of a human being who had lost everything, a soul completely and utterly adrift. It was the sound of my sister broken. And as I stood on a busy Chicago street with the life of the city swirling around me, I felt my carefully constructed wall of righteous anger begin to crumble. Revenge had been satisfying, but it had not been healing. It had exposed a monster, but it had also revealed a tragedy. And I was left with the chilling, complicated truth: sometimes the greatest casualty of your own war for justice is the lingering ghost of the love you once had for your enemy. The phone call with Isabelle left a strange resonance in its wake. Her ragged sobs echoed in my mind long after I had hung up. The cold, clean satisfaction of my revenge had become complicated, muddied by the raw sound of her complete and utter unraveling. Vengeance, I was beginning to understand, is a fire that consumes not only its target but also the ground on which the avenger stands. It had brought justice, but it had not brought peace. Weeks turned into a quiet, somber month. I continued my life in limbo, tethered to the dialysis machine, waiting for a call that might never come. My relationship with my parents remained a fragile, healing wound. They stopped trying to fill the silence with apologies and instead learned to simply be present. My father would come over and sit with me watching old movies, his presence a quiet admission of his failure. My mother, in a tentative return to her old self, started cooking for me again. She would bring over small containers of broth and meticulously prepared soft foods, her offerings, a silent language of remorse. We were a family learning to speak again, not with words but with gestures of shared grief. The call that changed everything came not in the middle of the night as I had always imagined, but on a gray Tuesday afternoon. I was at home sketching out a new menu idea, a practice that had become more of an act of faith than a practical exercise. When my phone rang with the hospital's number, my heart didn't leap. It simply stopped. There was a kidney, a deceased donor, a perfect match. The transplant coordinator spoke with a gentle urgency, telling me I needed to come to the hospital immediately. The world, which had been moving in slow motion for months, suddenly lurched into hyperspeed. The surgery, the recovery, it's all a blur of pain, medication, and exhaustion. But I remember the first moment I woke up in the ICU, a dull ache in my side where a new life had been stitched into me. The first conscious thought I had was not about my future, but about the profound, anonymous grief of another family somewhere whose greatest loss had just become my salvation. For the first time, the central drama of my own life felt small, humbled by the immense, impartial turnings of fate. My recovery was slow but steady. Marco was a constant presence, bringing food from the restaurant and handling the endless stream of well-wishing visitors. My parents were there every day, their faces etched with a gratitude so profound it was painful to watch. They were not just thankful for my life, they were thankful for a second chance to be the parents I had needed them to be. It was during my second week of recovery that I had an unexpected visitor. I was sitting up in my hospital chair looking out the window at the Chicago skyline when a nurse told me my sister was here to see me. My first instinct was to say no. But the memory of her broken sobs on the phone returned. I was no longer a victim fighting for survival. I was a survivor bearing the scars of the battle. I told the nurse to let her in. The Isabelle who walked into my room was a person I barely recognized. The sharp-tailored blazer was gone, replaced by a simple, ill-fitting sweater. Her perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her face, without its usual mask of makeup and confidence, looked pale and shockingly vulnerable. She didn't look like a corporate powerhouse. She looked like a lost child. She stood awkwardly by the door for a long moment, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. She didn't offer any excuses. She just started talking, her voice low and unsteady. She told me she had been seeing a therapist. She said she had been forced to confront things about herself she had spent her entire life burying. She told me about the crushing weight of being the perfect daughter. From the moment she could understand, she knew her role to be the embodiment of our parents' American dream. To get the best grades, to go to the best college, to get the best job. She said her entire sense of self-worth was tied to external validation, awards, promotions, praise. Love in her mind was something you earned through achievement. And then there was me. She confessed with tears streaming down her face that she had always been jealous of me. Not of my successes, but of my freedom. My freedom to fail, to be messy, to pursue a passion that didn't come with a guaranteed salary and a 401 Kelvin. She said our parents had worried about me, coddled me, and given me their unconditional support, while she had received only their expectations. When I opened Saigon Bloom, it wasn't just a restaurant to her. It was a tangible, beautiful thing I had created from nothing but my own talent and will. It was authentic. It was something she, with all her money and titles, could never create. It was proof that my worthless passion had value, and it invalidated her entire life's philosophy. "I didn't want your restaurant, Chloe," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I wanted to destroy it, because if it succeeded, it meant my whole life was a lie. It meant I had chased all the wrong things. I thought if I could control it, own it, it would finally make me feel real. Like you." Hearing her confession, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Her cruelty hadn't been born from a simple desire for money or power. It had been born from a profound and desperate emptiness. She had tried to destroy me not because she hated me, but because she couldn't bear the reflection of her own hollow life in the mirror of my happiness. I didn't offer her forgiveness. It wasn't mine to give in that moment. The wounds were too deep, the scars too fresh. But for the first time, I felt a flicker of understanding. I saw her not as a monster, but as a tragic figure, a prisoner in a gilded cage she had built for herself. The anger that had been my constant companion for so long finally completely dissipated. It left behind only a vast, quiet sadness for the sister I had, and for the sister I had never truly known. I simply told her that I hoped she would find a way to build a life that was truly her own. She nodded, wiping her eyes, and left without another word. I don't know if I will ever see her again. Some breaks are too profound to ever fully mend. 6 months later, I stood in the heart of Saigon Bloom. The restaurant was more successful than I had ever imagined, a bustling, joyful place filled with life. My health was restored, my body strong. The scar on my abdomen was a pale, silvery line, a permanent reminder of the price of a second chance. My parents were there, sitting at table 7. They were different now, quieter, more humble. Their love for me was no longer tangled up in pride or expectation. It was simpler, purer. They were just happy to see their daughter alive and whole. We were rebuilding one meal, one shared memory at a time. Marco was at the pass, calling out orders, his laughter echoing through the kitchen. Our friendship, forged in the crucible of my darkest days, had become the truest and most stable thing in my life. I had learned the most bitter of life's lessons. I learned that betrayal often wears the face of love, and that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who will hand your enemy the knife. I learned that the human heart is capable of a cruelty that defies logic, often born not of strength but of a desperate, gnawing weakness. But I had learned other things too. I learned that there is an incredible strength to be found in hitting rock bottom and choosing to stand back up. I learned that true family is not always defined by blood, but by the people who show up when the world has turned its back on you. I learned that revenge, while satisfying in the moment, is a hollow victory. True power isn't in destroying your enemy. It's in surviving them and then building a life so beautiful and full that they become an irrelevant footnote in your story. That night, a young food critic came to my table to compliment a dish. It was a new creation, a complex soup with a broth that took 2 days to prepare. He asked me what the secret ingredient was. I thought for a moment, my hand unconsciously going to the faint line on my abdomen. I thought of Isabelle's confession, of my parents' tearful apologies, of the anonymous family who had given me the gift of life. I thought of the fire of my rage and the quiet peace of my survival. I looked at the critic and smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. I told him the secret was simple. It was learning the difference between what you are willing to die for and what you are willing to live with. Some flavors, I explained, only emerge after the ingredients have been broken down, put through the fire, and given the time to heal into something stronger.